book apart, chapter by chapter, not verse by verse, because I really don't have time. And so we were really looking last week at chapter 3. Chapter 3 was interesting. One of the favorite verses in there is around verse 3, where it says that even though we are unfaithful, it does not nullify the promises of God. Right. Just because we're unfaithful, it doesn't mean God is going to be unfaithful, because God is not a man that he should lie. But what God says, that's what God's going to do. Yeah. And he's really explaining to us that salvation is by faith through grace and not by works. Now he's going to really give us a commentary on the life of Abraham. You may be seated, ushers, and if you read Romans chapter 4, that's all it really is. He's going to primarily talk about two individuals. He's going to quote one, and then he's going to give us a commentary on the other man's life. Now, he's going to start out in chapter 4 talking about Abraham. Why is Paul talking about Abraham? Because Abraham is considered by the Jews the father of the faith. Now, that is the person to whom they lifted up as a person who was justified, they thought, by his works. But what Paul wants to tell them, that he was not justified by works, but he was justified by his faith. He did some works and did some extraordinary things, and he is the father of faith. He's considered a friend of God, but none of that justified him. He was justified by his faith through grace, not by his works. And so I really don't want to talk and preach from the entire and every verse in chapter 4, but I want to just give you the first 3 verses, because the first 3 verses, he's going to introduce to us Abraham. And then the rest of the chapter is about a commentary on Abraham, because they had Abraham as their hero, the hero of faith, the father of the faith. They understood who Abraham was. Paul understood who he was. But what the problem was, they had a misunderstanding about Father Abraham. And he really wanted to use him as a catalyst to really explain this idea of faith in God. Now, really, you got to read this, and you got to really give it careful attention, because you'll miss it. Now, let me tell you, Abraham is great, and they had him as being somebody great. You know, Abraham is great in the 3 great religions in the world. And you know, I've told you this before, and I know you don't need to be reminded, but Abraham was great in the eyes of the Jews. He's great in the eyes of the Christians, but he's also great in the eyes of the Muslims. But he is considered the man. And so it's not strange that Paul would lift him up. And really, to understand Father Abraham, you know what I had to do? I had to go back to Genesis chapter 11 through chapter 25 of Genesis to cover the story of the life of Abram. Abram is how we are introduced in chapter 11 of Genesis. And then his name is eventually changed to Abraham. Now, you really got to study this. You can't gloss over this. You really got to look in detail of who Abraham was. But what Paul is trying to explain to us is that Abraham was justified by faith, not the law, because Abraham was 400 years before the law. And so he couldn't have been justified by the law. He had to be justified by grace. But then he wasn't justified by his works. In other words, his good deeds. Now listen, this is what I really discovered. We love to pick on Sarai for giving Abraham her handmaiden.
Go ahead.
But let me tell you, she ain't the only one. She ain't the only one. Because you remember what Abraham did when he was in Egypt. He gave his wife essentially to another man. Did not want to claim her as his wife. And the Pharaoh of Egypt, remember when there was a famine, she was so fine, but he was willing to give her up. And we think the flaw is only in Sarah, but Abraham wasn't perfect. That's what Paul wants us to understand. It wasn't that Abraham was perfect, but it was his faith. It's not that all of his deeds and his works were good, but it was by the grace of God. Abraham was not perfect. And that's what Paul wants us to understand, that even though he is the father of the faith, he did not have the law in order to be right with God, nor to be justified, because he was 400 years before the law of Moses. So it couldn't have been by the law that he was justified or made right with God. It had to be by his faith. And then the second thing he said, Abraham wasn't perfect. He was not a perfect man. And so therefore you might see him as the father of faith, but he was not a perfect man. He was given Hagar by his wife Sarai as a gift to do what God said he was going to do to help God out. But Abraham in Egypt didn't want to claim his wife and was willing to give her to another man to save his own life. So he was a coward. He wasn't perfect. And let me tell you, you're not perfect. And if you relied on your perfection to be right with God, everybody in here would miss the mark. Yeah. That's why in the previous chapter it says all have sinned. Yes. And the word is fall short. Yes. We all miss the mark. You miss it, I miss it. And just like one scholar I was reading, he uncovered some flaws in Abraham. If we look deep enough, we'll uncover some flaws in you. Ain't it the truth what I'm saying? If you look deep enough into anybody's life, if you go into anybody's closet, if you turn over the stones in anybody's life, if you fall in anybody's home, you're going to find something. And that's really what one scholar wanted me to tell you. Abraham wasn't perfect, even though he was right with God, because God accredited him. You're going to see that in the text. I'm going to get to the text, but you're going to see that word accredited to him. In other words, he could not afford, he could not pay, he could not liquidate his debt with God. And so God wiped out his debt. God acquitted him and found him innocent, even though he was guilty. And all of us are in the same category. God finds us guilty, but he accounts or accredits to us his righteousness because of our faith. And so I really wanted to look at this, faith in God. And my brothers and sisters, really what I want to emphasize as I teach this text is that your faith must be in God. It must not be in the law. It can't be in your works. It can't be in your good deed. Your faith has to be in God and God alone. And don't let your faith be in you, in your good deed, your righteous deeds, or your good behavior, because you're only good when you have to be and when everybody's watching. But if the truth be told, you ain't that good. And so let's look at this because he's going to talk about it. Now, I really was supposed to explain to you who Abraham was, going back to Genesis chapter 11, where we introduced to Abram and his birth through his father Terah, and how he was the uncle of Lot, and he received custody of Lot at about 35 years old because Lot's father died, Haran, and so he legally became the responsibility of Abram. And so Abram assumed the responsibility of Lot. That's why he carried Lot everywhere that he went. And so here is Abraham that we're introduced in Genesis chapter 11. And then in Genesis chapter 12, we see how God starts dealing with Abraham. And he asks Abraham or Abram to do some extraordinary things. Now, everything that Abram done in Genesis chapter 12 to Genesis chapter 25 is all about Abram's faith. He trusted God. And what Paul is going to do, he's going to lay out the argument that Abram was a man of faith. And really, he had faith in God on every step of the journey. He had to trust God. Even though he wasn't perfect, Even though he made some mistakes, he trusted God. Now, I really wanted to talk today about faith because some of us really don't have any idea what real faith is. Because of the hyper faith movement, because of the name it and claim it, because of the sow it and receive it, because of all of this new age stuff, we really don't understand what faith really is. Real faith in God is demonstrated in the life of Abram, starting in Genesis chapter 12, because God expects him to do some extraordinary things and some great things without any evidence of how they're going to get done, or even if they're going to get done. Let me give you a good definition of faith is to trust God. Amen. And my brothers and sisters, if you don't trust God, and I've explained to you many times, the only obsession God has is for you to trust him. If God can ever get you to trust him, God will take care of you in every area of your life, about everything in your life, and you will go lacking nothing. Right. If you can ever learn to trust God. All right. To have faith in God is to trust him all the way in every situation is to trust God. And that ain't no easy thing. You know why? Because you got to trust God when you don't know what he's doing. You got to trust God when you don't know how he's going to do it. You got to trust God and you don't know when he's going to do it. And you got to even trust God, and here's the big one, and you don't even know if he's going to do it. But you still trust God, because God is not a man that he should lie. One scholar wanted me to tell you, boy, I'm so excited about this text, and we talked about it last week, that God, if he makes a promise, he's going to keep that promise in spite of what you do, or in spite of what you don't do. And I told you last week, the illustration last week, one scholar wanted me to tell you, that he promised to take the Hebrew people from Egypt to the promised land. Yeah. Now, you know as well as I know, they did not act right on their way to the promised land. Yeah. But it did not nullify the promise of God. Yeah. God said, I'm coming to get you from Egypt. I'm taking you to the promised land. And all the way from Egypt to the promised land, they acted a fool. All they did was complain, fuss, argue, disobey God, and they rebelled against Moses, but God kept his promise. Because the unfaithfulness of men do not nullify the promise of God. That's what chapter 3 tells us. Whatever God promised, God gonna keep his promise to you. And God's promise has nothing to do with what you do and don't do. If he promised it, it's going to happen. You might have to take the long way around, or go up the rough side of the mountain, or take the rough path, but you're going to get what God promised you. You're going to get it. Nothing nullifies the promises of God. And it's one of my new favorite verses that I'm going to read it to myself every day now. And in the 3rd chapter of Romans, verse number 3, what if some were unfaithful? Will the unfaithful nullify the faithfulness of God? Yeah. I am standing on the promises of God. God keeps his promises even when I don't keep mine. God is faithful to me when I'm not faithful to him. God does what he says he's going to do, even when I don't do what I say I'm doing. Ain't that the truth what I'm saying? Because some of y'all know it's the truth because you told God a whole lot of stuff. And you ain't done none. You ain't done none of that stuff. You ain't been to church for 2 months this year. All right. And you done made a whole lot of promises, and you ain't kept, but by the 10 you made, you kept 1.5. But God still kept his promise. Let me give you this, because I really want to kind of get into this. In Genesis chapter 12, like I talk a little bit about Abraham to give some background information. First of all, Abraham was in Ur the Chaldeans and living a pretty good life with his father, Terah with his nephew, Lot. And Terah was getting old, and the Lord told Abraham, get up and get away from these folk. Get away from this country. And go to a place I shall show you. You know what faith in God is? It's to trust that God knows what he's doing with your life. I mean, it's hard. Because, see, you lean to your own understanding. And that verse in Proverbs says, lean not to your own understanding. And see, the problem is you got to understand everything God is doing in your life. And if you have to do that, you don't have faith in God. You got faith in yourself. He told him to get up and leave a place of familiarity. I mean, he was familiar with the city of Ur, of the Chaldeans, and his father's house and his father's family and all of his familiar surroundings. But God told him one day, God showed up and said, leave. Don't nobody want to leave what gives them comfort, security, and familiarity. Don't nobody want to leave. But if you have faith in God, God will ask you to do strange and unusual things. And let me tell you, if what God is asking you to do is not strange and unusual, and if it doesn't go against what you would normally do, it's probably not God. God will ask you to do some strange things. He'll let you get comfortable in a place and then tell you to leave that place of comfort. I don't really want to talk too much about this because I'm trying to stay calm, but listen, he told him to leave a familiar place. But let me tell you, this is the problem most of us have. He told him to leave some familiar people. The reason why we really can't get to the next level in our life because we don't want to leave familiar people, because we are codependent and dependent upon those people. Let me tell you, if you stay around people that you need, you're going to give God room to really bless you. Because see, you'll start thinking it's them and not him. Let me tell you, don't get so comfortable with people. I had to counsel somebody just the other day about the death of their pastor and the death of the first lady, and they were devastated, wasn't going to church no more, and listen, they were just traumatized and had lost their faith. But then I had to point them to the scripture that said, in the year King Uzziah died. That's when Isaiah said, I saw the Lord. Uzziah represented comfort, security. Sometimes God will take people out of your life so that you look at him and not them. All right. I'm telling you, my brothers and sisters, don't get too comfortable, because anybody can be taken out of your life at any time. And God is not trying to drive a wedge between you and him. God is trying to get you to be closer to him so he can be closer to you. But if you look at it as when God takes people out of our lives, that God is trying to drive a wedge between you and him, you'll never see the big picture. Sometimes God wants you to get closer to him. And he takes those people out. And so he said to Abram, leave your father's house, your father's country, and your father's family, and go to a land that I shall show you. He's talking about having faith in God. So to leave the familiar, to go to the unfamiliar. Many of you, you're missing the blessing. You're missing what I just said. And see, the reason why you keep praying and your prayers don't get answered is because you won't leave the familiar to go to the unfamiliar. You know, we don't like change. We don't like anything strange. And we don't like change. And if you don't like strange things, and if you don't like change, you're probably not going to really be able to walk in the place where God is trying to take you. Listen, change is going to happen. A change of environment, a change of mind, a change of attitude, a change of environment. And everything you go into is going to be strange. He told him to go to the land of Canaan. And one scholar wanted me to tell you, Abram knew nothing about Canaan. Nothing. But he did know about Ur the Chaldeans, where he grew up in Mesopotamia, in this very familiar culture where his father was successful. He was becoming successful, and now he was to go to a place he was completely unfamiliar with. And on his way to Canaan, his father Terah died in Hebron, and so he had to journey on. And then he got there. And guess what? I don't have time to explain it to you. When he got there, the text says, and I ain't got time to go to Genesis, all of it, but when he got where God told him to get, guess what? A famine hit the land. Now that's some crazy stuff. Now, look, God, we got to have a conversation. Now you just told me to leave a place of familiarity, a place of comfort, a place where I'm doing good. Now I am going to a place where you told me to go, to walk away from everything, to leave everything, and now I'm in Canaan, and now there is a famine in Canaan. All right. Man, some of y'all like me would have a problem with the law. Now I'm blessed right here. I'm doing good. You telling me to leave and go to a land, and I get to that land, and then a famine breaks out. We know a famine breaks out because he leaves the land of Canaan and goes down to Egypt. And that's where he denies that his wife Sarah is his wife. That's strange, my brothers and sisters. Leave this place where I'm blessed to follow God's direction, and God's direction lead me to a place where a famine breaks out. One scholar wanted me to tell you, I ain't got time to really point to you in Genesis, but it's interesting that he went to Egypt, but God didn't tell him to go to Egypt. He took the initiative to go to Egypt. The text says, I ain't got time to really, it's in Genesis. It says, and Abram went to Egypt. God didn't tell him. He took it upon his own, took the initiative to say, it's a famine here, ain't no food, and I'm going to leave and go to Egypt. But when he got to Egypt, he started doing stuff his own way. But I don't have time. I got to rush the story because I really don't have a lot of time. But let me explain this to you. Even though he went to Canaan and there was a famine, he went down to Egypt. Boy, I really don't want to explain this to you because you're going to get happy when I tell you this. But even though he went where God told him to go and there was a famine, when he went down to Egypt, he got blessed even though he lied about his wife being his wife. He was blessed in Egypt. You know that historically, Abram got most of his wealth from Egypt. Because when he got down there, he was blessed by Pharaoh. And literally, what Abram did, and I know this is going to shock you. Really, he bargained his wife. And when he gave his wife to Pharaoh, Pharaoh gave him some stuff for his wife. And he lied and said that he didn't really lie. He told the half-truth. Because it was his sister, but it was also his wife by marriage, legally. And then Pharaoh took her because he took Abram at his word. But Abram knew that he wasn't right. And so Pharaoh took her and was getting her ready for her. And all of a sudden he found out. But it was too late when he found out because he took what God had given to Abraham. And when he took it, tragedy and sickness and all kind of catastrophic calamities fell upon Pharaoh. And Pharaoh had enough sense to realize that there's something different about this. This ain't just a natural occurrence. This ain't just by chance or circumstance. And he told Abram, he said, you get your wife and you get the stuff I gave you, and here's some more stuff, and you get out of here because you got a God on your side. And he said, you got to hit the road, Jack. And even in the mess of Abram and his folly in Egypt, God blessed him, because let me tell you, when you have faith in God, God's promises are sure. God doesn't lie. Even when you start some mess, create some mess, stir mess, God can still use the mess to bless you. Some of y'all ain't living good because you've been good. It's because you've been messy. And some of the blessings you got ain't because you've been a good business person or a prudent business person. It was messy, and God bless you with that and in that. Anyway. And so he ended up, I'm just trying to tell the story before I go to my text, and he got that girl back, and they went on back up to Canaan. When they got to Canaan, got back in Canaan, and a whole lot of stuff happened in Canaan. Because when he got back up there, the Lord started talking to him and telling him some stuff. Telling him some stuff that really didn't make sense because of the age he was. It really didn't make sense because of the age Sarah was. The Lord started making a promise and said, listen, it's going to be through your seed that the whole world is going to be blessed. And I'm going to multiply your family. And Abram didn't have no children. And I've got to tell you, you got to go back to chapter 12, or really chapter 11, because it's going to be something very notable in chapter 11. It's going to talk about the wives of the sons of Torah. And it's going to talk about Abraham and Sarah. And it's going to tell us very explicitly that she was barren. She couldn't have kids. And so it wasn't it wasn't later in Abram's life that he knew his wife couldn't have kids. It was in chapter 11. He knew just by when they first got married that his wife was barren. But now God is going to make him a promise based on information that he already knows, his circumstance and the circumstance of his wife. And God says, through your seed, through your seed, I'm going to make you great.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, Abram went and told Sarah, she laughed. One scholar said, Abram chuckled and said, really? I mean, they were beyond childbearing years. This was an impossible situation based upon human involvement. And that's really the third point I really want to get to, because I told you that Abraham was justified by his faith, not by the law, because he's 40 years before the law. He wasn't justified by his works. I needed to explain that to you. But not only was he not justified by the law or works, but he was not justified by any human effort. You know what faith in God is always to look at the effort of God, not human effort. Now listen, I want to explain to some of these prosperity gospel preachers, because I'm sick of them. If you can explain the miracle, then it's not a miracle. Because a miracle can't be explained. Now don't tell me how you got blessed, because if you can tell me how you got blessed, then it ain't.
That's right.
Because that involves human effort. In other words, if you have to do something to get something to be blessed, it's not a miracle. I sowed a seed, and the Lord blessed me. Well, you can explain that. That's not a miracle. I sowed a seed and the Lord healed me. You just explained to me how you say it happened. That's not a miracle. Let me tell you what a miracle is by the definitions of Jesus in the Gospels that are recorded in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A miracle is when you can take 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread and feed a multitude, and you ain't got no assembly line, and you ain't got no meal to greet. Do I have any witnesses? And listen, a miracle is when you can take 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread, and don't nobody go fishing, don't nobody open a factory, and every time you reach in a bag, What went in there was 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. 2 baskets. And every time the disciples reached their hand down in their fish and bread, that's a miracle. You can't explain that. You don't know what a miracle is? A miracle is when you're setting up in the mountains, your disciple is in the water, a storm comes, and you see them toiling all night long, and you want to comfort them, and what you do is you make a highway on the water. And you walk on water, defying physics.
That's right. That's right.
You can't explain that. If you can explain it and attribute human effort to it, it is not. It ain't a miracle. Boy, I tell you, not by any human effort was this miracle and this promise of a son was going to happen. Because Abram and Sarah had already dismissed that. It ain't happening because we old, and she's been barren for a long time. And I don't have time because I could be a little comedic here, but I'm going to tell you that Abram wasn't the problem, Sarah was. We know Abram wasn't the problem because he got the young girl pregnant. He just couldn't get the old one. Do I have any witnesses in here? He couldn't get Sarah pregnant, but he got Hagar because she was young. So he wasn't the problem. He knew his wife was the issue. And she laughed at God and said, this ain't happening. But let me tell you, human effort is when you try to help God. And I really want to put some emphasis here because I'm talking about faith in God. When you try to help God out, you make a mess.
That's right.
And you involve so many people, and not only do you make a mess, but you mess up other people's lives. When you try to help God out, when you involve people that ain't got nothing to do with this promise, Hagar didn't have nothing to do with the promise God made to Abram and Sarah. But they tried to help God out, drug her into this mess. They tried to use human effort in order to bring about the promise of God. And so they tried to help him out and just made a mess of the situation. And Sarah got upset one day, looked at that kitchen window washing the dishes. Hagar out there with Ishmael and Ishmael and Abram out there throwing a ball. She in there washing dishes. And then she fooled around and looked at Hagar, and Hagar started smiling. That was it. She too happy now. I gave her my husband, but now she acting real. She too happy. Called Abram in the house and look at she got to go. Her and that bastard child got to go. Because see, that's what happened when human effort tries to mess with what God promised. God promised. I'm just trying to explain to you what faith in God is. It is to understand that what God has promised is not going to be done through human effort, human environment. If it's human effort and human environment is not a miracle. So God finally allowed this conception to happen, and she got pregnant. And now he has a son. But now listen, around chapter 4, verse 19, I didn't really see this, 18 through 19, it explains to us the great faith that Abram had in God. You got to understand that God is challenging his faith on every corner. On every turn, God is challenging his faith. Because now God gives him what he promised to give him, which was a seed or a son. Yeah. And that son would produce a nation. And now God calls into question the faith of Abraham, who has been exemplary in his faith up until this point. This was the hardest decision he ever had to make. Because when you have to sacrifice what you love that God gave you, that God promised to you, that's when God really challenges your faith. To lose what you love that you pray about, that you've always wanted. And now you got to give it. That's not strong enough. Kill it.
That's right.
Not give it, but kill it.
That's right.
It's one thing to give something to God. It's another thing to offer something as a sacrifice.
That's
Could you imagine Dodie taking that grandbaby and laying it on the altar and God said, kill it? That would be a hard decision. Could nobody in here be faced with that decision and make the right choice? Because you labored. I was pregnant 9 months. And you were praying for this blessing. You were praying for this miracle. And God brought it to pass. Now God said, show me how much you love me more than you love it. That's the challenge of real faith in God. What do you love more, him or what he gives you?
That's right. That's right.
And then chapter verses 11 through 19, I really didn't get it till I understood the mind. You got to go into the mind of Abraham to understand his faith in God. He's explaining how his faith was accredited to him. God gave him what he gave him because of his faith. So Abram has to sacrifice now his son. And this is a tough decision to give to God what you love, that he gave to you, that he said he was going to bless you through. And see, we don't want to sacrifice nothing that God blesses us through. He blesses us with it so that he can bless us through what he blessed us with. Now, Abraham saw in Isaac the blessings of God, the promise of God, and I love what this verse says, and hope for the future. That's what he saw in Isaac, hope for the future. Yes. That his line and lineage would go on. That he could see God's promises in his son because his son had 2 sons. They didn't get along that way, but he had them. Yeah. But it was, and then them sons had a whole lot of sons. Yeah. And one of them, Jacob, had 12 sons. Yeah. Who were the 12 tribes of Israel. And they multiplied, and it was from the 12 sons of Jacob that a nation was born in Egypt. All of that hinged upon one person that God promised to give him. But the one person now God's saying, take that blessing, that seed, go up on the mountain, and I want you to kill it. The word sacrifice is too theological. Let me give it to you in the modern vernacular. Kill him. Kill it. Now, listen. It would have been one thing if God would have told him to kill him instantly right now. But God gave him time and opportunity because he gave him a distant place to offer him as a sacrifice. So he had time to think about it on the way to sacrificing him. Now, all of the processes of his mind. And you know he had to think about his wife. You know he had to tell Sarai, God has told me the son that you had in your old age, I've got to go kill him. Could you imagine the deliberation, the agony? And she relented and gave. Boy, if I had time, I'd explain to you. I don't really want to go here with you, but I can explain to you. Sometimes sisters, single mothers, and all of you women who have children, sometimes you have to let somebody lead even when you don't understand what they're doing. What God is telling them to do. Could you imagine going to get your son of your old age and tell your wife, God told me to take him and go offer him as a sacrifice? The disappointment she feels, the agony that she feels. She is a type of Mary who gave her son voluntarily to God to be a sacrifice for us all. And on the way to that place of sacrifice, he deliberated. And then Isaac started speaking up. What you love started speaking up. And Isaac said, Dad, I see the fire and I see the wood, but where's the sacrifice? Ain't that something? And Isaac wasn't a little boy. He was probably 21 or 22 years old. And he knew full well. And Abram didn't even respond. All he said, and you got to learn to say this if you're going to have a life of faith in God. Sometimes you don't know how God going to do it. You don't even know if God going to do it. But Abram said, God will provide a sacrifice for himself. And even in the process of going, he realized that God would provide. Now, some scholars have conflict in this particular narrative because it says, was he really going to sacrifice his son? Listen, in verses 18 and 19 of chapter 4, it explains to us that Abram absolutely was going to sacrifice his son because he believed that God could raise him from the dead. He knew whatever God said he was going to do, God was not a man that he should lie. He believed that even if he sacrificed his son, he knew God could raise him. He didn't know whether God would, but he believed God could. Because whatever you sacrifice for God, God can bring it back to life. I'm trying to explain to you, a man of faith. And so he gets up there and he lays his son on that altar, ties him up, and gets ready to kill him and then cut him up. And it's a sacrifice to God. And that great illustration I give, it wasn't when he done this, knife, God stopped him. It wouldn't when he done this that God stopped him. It really wasn't even when he got here God stopped him. It wasn't until he got stopped. Millimeters, centimeters from his chest. God said, stop. Now I know that you love me more than you love the blessings. I really want to explain to you, you get caught up in all these blessings, but the blesser is who you ought to be worshiping. You don't ever get caught up in what God gives you, because what God gives you, Job said, for the Lord is given and the Lord has taken away. Don't get too caught up in these things God gives us, because God can take them away. You got to keep your eyes on him. God still required a sacrifice that day, and there was a ram caught in a thicket. Untied Isaac, and they got the sacrifice and put that ram on the altar, because God provides for himself. You want to know what faith in God is? It's to trust God when you don't understand. Trust God when you don't know. And you are justified by your faith. Faith is what opens doors. Faith is what brings blessings. Faith is what gets you to the next level. Not human effort. Faith. My faith looks up to thee, thy Lamb of Calvary. I'm telling you, my faith is what brought me. And I'm going to give you verse 3, and I'm going to give you these verses, and I'm going to my seat now. You know what it says? Abraham believed God, and it was accredited to him as righteousness, because he believed God. Faith in God.
Yes, sir.
Don't look at you. Don't look at what's outside of you. Don't look at anything you can do.
Yes, sir.
That's not faith. Faith is when you trust God completely and trust God wholly. Verse 6 says, and David, in the same way, when he spoke the blessings of the one whom God credited righteousness, apart from works, he says, blessed are those to whom transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. God did not count righteous those who did good, kept the law, but those to whom he chose to forgive, he covered their sin. And listen, verse 8, you better show no shout about it. Because he will not ever count your sins against you. You got to know when to shout, because you got some sins. You got some stuff you've done and that you are doing and that you will do, and he does not count them. See, God ain't like us. We hold stuff against one another. and we count it against people, but God knows all this stuff. He don't count it. But, okay, y'all need to really explain this to you because you get a little sophisticated. Now let me explain this to you. God knows everything about you, but you ask him for stuff. But if he held what he know about you and what you do that he know you do, you wouldn't get the blessing. But he knows what you do that you ain't supposed to do when you violate his word, but he doesn't hold that against. He know you lying before you open your mouth. He know you ain't telling the truth. You ain't been more gonna do no better. You ain't gonna stop nothing. But he don't count none of that. Lord, if you get me out of this, he know you lying. But he don't count that against you. Because he says, blessed is the one in verse 8, whom sins the Lord will never count against them, because Jesus paid the price. He never holds my sins against me. He blesses me in spite of. Man, I'm telling you, I'm glad because he doesn't count. Let me give it to you in this picture, because you're going to get this, TJ. You ain't, because you got money. But I should call somebody else's name. If you ever go to the bank and you forgot you ain't got the amount in there you trying to get, and you go up to the teller, all happy-go-lucky, fill out the withdrawal slip, and you put it for 100, and you ain't got but 30, they going to count against you that you ain't got what you're trying to get. But see, God knows your account is always in the negative. Do I have any witnesses in here? He always knows. When you go to heaven's bank and you pray and you try to withdraw stuff, you ain't got enough to withdraw nothing. But he go on and write the check.
All right.
Clyde, he write out that check anyway. He don't count your deficit against you, because I thank God for that. I ain't had the most productive, spiritual, godly week. And I came here and my account was in the negative and in the red, but I needed his blessings to get up and start my day. And to come down this highway, and I needed safe passage. And if he counted against me, my trespasses and sins, I probably wouldn't have made it. But he went on and wrote me that check anyway. Woke me up early this morning, touched me with a finger of divine love, kept that car on that side of the yellow line, kept mine on this side. The deer didn't run out in the yard. The fire didn't make me have an accident. He kept. It could have been the other way.
That's right.
And Job says it's a quote in Job, one of my favorite, Dr. Frank Ray's favorite. He says he take my sins, he put them in a bag and throws them into the sea of forgiveness. Never to be brought up again. Verse 13, and I'm finishing. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received a promise to be the heirs of the world, but it was through the righteousness that was by faith. He's simply saying, if you get anything from God, it's going to be because of your faith in God. God know you ain't right. God know you don't deserve it, but he will give it to you if you got faith. Let it will. I don't have time, but I really want to just kind of stick a pin right here. Quit trying to let people tell you the kind of faith you need to get what God is wanting to give it to you. Because you go to all these churches now, everybody tell you the kind of faith. Listen, I'm telling you the kind of faith you need. The kind of faith where you trust God. And sometimes when you trust God, you don't know how God going to do it, when God going to do it, if God going to do it. But you believe based on his word. It wasn't about a long it was by faith. He received all of these blessings. And then verse 18 is really the one I want to hinge my sermon on. Because see, this is what faith really is. See what verse 18 says? Against all hope. Abraham, in hope, believed. It sounds like it is a double negative, but it says against all hope. But in hope. Against all hope. In other words, the odds were stacked against Abraham every time. Nothing looked like it should happen, it ought to happen, and that it would happen against all hope. The old folks said between a rock and a hard place. He opened doors that have sure enough been shut in your face. And he a way out of.
All right.
Ain't no way this gonna happen. Because if the Lord don't do it. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. Against all hope, you are where you are, got what you got, and that you still alive against all. It should have been the other way. But God. Against all the odds. But Abraham in hope. In hope, listen, hope is Obama, he wrote this book, The Audacity of Hope. You know, hope is a real strange thing. Because hope don't have any evidence. Hope is just a wish that hadn't come true, and you don't know how it's going to come true. And you know you done tried to do something, because he talks about his ascent to the presidency, because ain't no way a community organizer from Chicago, state senator, that goes to the Congress of the United States, then elevated and elected to president twice. Now he said he didn't even have enough hope to believe that it was possible, but the audacity of hope to look in what it seems impossible, that defies all logic. The audacity to have that kind of hope. Against all hope. But Abraham in hope believed. And then I got to close here, because let me tell you, God will make things happen. He let salvation happen because of faith through grace, not because of human effort, but because of divine effort. What is faith in God? And I'm closing, because faith in God, he going to kind of close this out, but he really going to kind of tie this to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he going to talk about, you can have hope in God if you believe in the resurrection, because the resurrection was against all hope. Because never before has a man ever been put to death, and he was raised from the dead. Now Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but that was another man raising another man. But Jesus was put to death. And you know, the old black preacher said he got up. He raised himself up from the dead. But before he got in that grave, he says, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up again. And Paul says it's not hard to hope against hope and believe in hope when you understand that God raised Jesus from the dead. Jordan Peterson says this. Now, this is two things. You got to, if you can believe these, if you can get to a place where you believe these two things, you can open up endless possibilities in your life. It's not going to be hard to believe in God, and it's not going to be hard to believe that God can do anything. If you believe these two things, all that's in this book, if you can believe these two things that are in this book, you can open up an endless possibilities of God doing anything in your life. The two things Jordan Peterson said you have to believe. And if you believe these things, if you got enough faith to put your faith in these two things, one is Genesis chapter 1. See, it's not easy. I'm saying it, but you understand how hard it is to believe Genesis chapter 1. Not in the Big Bang Theory, not in evolution, but in the beginning, God. If you can get enough faith to believe that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, not a Big Bang Theory, not evolution. But if you can get your faith to a place where you believe Genesis chapter 1, you can open up endless possibilities. And he said that's what makes him live as if though God is real. Because he came to a place where he could accept Genesis chapter 1, which is intelligent design that God created the heavens and the earth. The second thing he says, you got to get to a place where you believe that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. You got to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The two hardest things to believe in the Bible is in the beginning, and that God raised Jesus from the dead. Those two things that atheists can't accept. First of all, the origin of all things, who is God, that God could raise Jesus Christ up. They don't doubt that Jesus Christ was literally a historical figure, that he was a prophet, but they struggle with the fact that Jesus Christ got up on the third day with all power. I'm beginning to love a little poetry, but you got to really see this thing the way the poet saw it. This inspiration of Scripture, how these men wrote down the inspiration of God, but you also got to understand some of this poetry. So I came up with a little poetry myself. I ain't that smart, but I came up with a little poetry. How Jesus Christ was in the beginning, according to John chapter 1, he was in the beginning. And Jesus came from time, went back into eternity, and then came from eternity, came back into time. Y'all see what I'm saying? Because see, in Genesis chapter 1, he said, let us. So he came from eternity into time, went back in to eternity. But then in Genesis 3:15, the Father said, one day I got to send you back in time. Because it says the heels of the Savior bruised the head of the serpent. And then the old Negro preacher said, in 42 generations, he left eternity again, stepped into time. Go ahead, Doc. In Bethlehem. Boom. Boom. Through a virgin. The Catholics call it the Immaculate Conception. That Abraham and Sarah had a baby by having relations. But this way, God was going to do it uniquely. She was going to get pregnant without the aid of a man. That go back to believe in Genesis chapter 1, that in the beginning God spoke something into nothing. And he didn't use construction, didn't use any. It says the voice of God spoke. And he stepped in time, in space, created matter. And Jesus was born in Bethlehem and lived about 33 years. And then he that was in time went back to eternity, then came back into time. And now he about to go back into eternity. Because when he died, can I explain it to you, express it to you? You understand what happened when he died, don't you? Because Genesis chapter 1 says, in the beginning God created heaven and the earth, and everything was created by him according to Colossians, and the Word in the world was created by him. But when the Word died, the world reacted. The world that he created, the sun refused to shine. The moon dripped in blood. The earth had an epileptic seizure, and the dead in Jerusalem got up. When he died. But then somebody cried, surely. This must be. It got to be. And then he died and they put him in a borrowed tomb and rose 3 days later. But then he who was in time and went back to eternity, came back into time, was now about to go back up on that mountain, called them and told them, not only did he call them to see his resurrected body, now he's finna call them because he finna go back and an express limousine service, the Shekinah glory cloud of God came down for him to step on. Because he went up in a cloud, on a cloud, and it lifted him up. And he said, why stand here ye gazing? The same Jesus you see going up, gonna come back again. Are you ready? He's on his way. And it don't look like it. It look like Trump's in control, the Republicans in control. But I need to tell you, God is in. I need to tell you why you need to be worried about it, because God always shows up in the midst of chaos. When the world is in chaos, he shows up. But you got to hope against hope, and let your hope be in God. Every head bowed and every eye closed. I'm telling you, God can do the impossible. Paul says Abraham's faith, God's grace, not human effort, but divine effort, is what made Abraham approved and God accredited to him righteousness. Not because he was righteous, but because God made him righteous because of his faith. If you're here today and you don't know Jesus Christ, I'm telling you, faith in God will open unlimited doors, unlimited possibilities. If you can have faith in God, trust God when you don't know how he's going to do it, when he's going to do it, if he's going to do it, how he's going to do it, but just trust God. It says, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these other things shall be added unto you. God takes the responsibility to take care of you when you trust him. Yes. If you're here today and you don't know Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, if you're here today and you want to join the church, if you're here today and you desire to reconcile and to be made right with God, if you're here today and you just desire prayer, you can say to me, Pastor, I don't know what God is doing. I know he's up to something. But I'm going to trust God in this process as he orders my steps. If you're here today, you can come. The door of the church is open. Is there one who will come? I will trust in the Lord. I will trust in the Lord. I will trust in the Lord until I